Recently, I just finished an anime called Ascendance of a Bookworm. Although the animation style of this anime isn't that good, this is definitely one of the most relaxing isekai anime I have ever watched in 2019. In this anime, there aren't any fast-paced action scenes or intelligent battle of wits. It's just about a girl who died and gets reincarnated in a new world, wanting to make books. To get books, she kneels and begs people for books, as well as using ancient civilizations' methods of making books and writing in them. If you don't understand why she's so crazy for books, just pretend that instead of a book, it's a smartphone. I think the reason this anime gave me such an enjoyable watch was because it has a nice slice of life theme to it, but sometimes I'm really confused as to why there are 6-floor tall wooden buildings during the Middle Ages in Europe. And also, are they really throwing feces out of their windows? After researching a bit, I found out these types of buildings are timber-framed buildings, built with heavy timbers that are joined together. It's actually quite common in wooden buildings during the 19th century, so it is possible to build a 6-floor building in Europe at that time. In the early Middle Ages, European cities were quite small. Even 10,000 people in a city were considered top tier for cities. Due to the lack of urban construction experience, they didn't have any drainage systems in place, nor waste collection at first. It was common practice for people to just literally throw waste directly out of their windows. So at that time, the streets of London, England, and Paris, France were filled with a mixture of feces and soil. If you were to walk on the streets, you would be pissed. For women, their skirts and shoes were stained with feces. Thus, to counter this, they would wear high heels, which became popular. As the cities grew larger and larger, the rulers finally took action to deal with urban pollution. The French dumped excrement outside the city, and the British dumped garbage in the river. Unfortunately, with the explosion of the urban population, the problem of waste and feces had not been resolved. The feces of Paris, France, in the late Middle Ages were so high that they could drown the walls of Paris, and the Thames Channel in England faced blockages due to waste. To solve these problems, the French cleverly raised the city walls, while the British reclaimed land. At the time, the average life expectancy of the people in London were only a little more than 30 years, 20 for the French. On a side note, in the days when toilet paper were not available, medieval Europeans used licorice, dried moss, or grass ashes to clean up their excrement. This is what toilet paper looked like during the Middle Ages. The drain they used usually faced a moat or ditch of a castle, and the bad smell produced was also a part of the city's defense system. Of course, a considerable portion of the waste would be collected and used as fertilizer in the fields, and also recycled by the castle sewage system. For toilets, generally 2 toilets or several side-by-side toilets will use a flushing water source, and the waste will be flushed by the castle rainwater's tank. The natural precipitation washed away the waste to keep the castle sanitary. They later had public baths in the city, but don't consider the medieval public baths to be similar to modern public baths. In public bathrooms, they had no paper towels yet and would usually wrap sponges on iron bars to wipe. However, it would be rinsed with water after wiping, which would apparently be convenient for the next person. Later, due to the extremely poor sanitary conditions, a terrible Black Death would break out and spread fast within Europe. But because the church monopolized the medical cause, the ancient Europeans' medical concept was extremely backwards when it came to helping people, and there was no response to the plague. The doctors of that time will not give you all the information you would need, but they will perform bloodletting, force vomit, give enema, opium, holy water, mummy powder, and other treatments. As for how long you can live, well, that depends on how powerful your main character buff is. If you didn't know, the toilet that we are familiar with today derived its shape from as early as the 16th century. In the 19th century, after the British plumber Thomas Crapp transformed it, most models are now based off of his work. So if you ever were to travel to another world, let's just say, try to choose a world after the 16th century. Although it may sound dirty and horrible for Europe at the time, we can't use a modern perspective when we judge the health standards of 100 years ago. They have toilets and use dried moss as toilet paper. They had running water in almost every city to keep it clean. They also brush their teeth with fine wool or hay wrapped in tender hazel branches. Scented plants such as sage, rosemary, and thyme were also added to butter, mutton, or lard to make scented soaps. Not only soap, but some medieval nobles also used linen cloth to cover the warm water of cooked barley and used this linen cloth to keep their skin shiny. Therefore, like us, they bathe daily with soap and brush their teeth and even perform facial treatments. It can be seen that the personal hygiene habits of medieval Europeans weren't that bad. Like us, they're working hard to maintain personal hygiene in their environment. But they still don't have smartphones, Wi-Fi, or delicious food. Maybe the things in isekais are not the same as what you would expect. The expectation of an isekai would be to go to a school to study magic, or go to dungeons to challenge those monsters of your friends. After a hard day's night, you go to the bar to crack open a cold one with the boys. And maybe if you're lucky, you can have a harem of some other species of females. But the reality of isekais are more similar to Grimgar of Fantasy and Ash. If you were to be transferred to another world, you would have to collect many partners to hunt monsters in order to survive. And every monster is extremely powerful, especially since you and your teammates came from another world. You have no knowledge of how to hunt, and your teamwork might be non-existent. Every adventure has some life-risking challenges. If you're lucky and find a single goblin to defeat and sell its loot for money, Then you're finally able to eat meat for dinner and purchase secondhand underwear. On the other hand, if you're not so lucky and are unable to find a single target to hunt, you and your teammate can only come back to your base, lie down on the hard stone, cover yourself with a thin layer of grass, and endure the hunger and cold. After learning some magic and training yourselves, you may feel like you and your partner can challenge stronger monsters, but the only thing that's waiting for you is a big GG. But what about farming? Hunting is a daunting task, but farming has to be much easier compared to it, right? Yeah, sorry to break it to you, farming in Europe at that time isn't as easy as you think. Before the year 1000, they didn't eat to eat good food, they ate to not die. Before 1492, the discovery of new land, and corn, tomatoes, and potatoes being brought over to Europe, their food was scarce and tasteless. As for the chivalry culture, there is a common misunderstanding that chivalry culture at that time was to be like a gentleman. An example of the most common misunderstanding is that the ancient knights had to protect women's interest and their dignity in any way they could. Many stories about saving women were told, and a theme of women being rescued and her giving you a handkerchief as her way of thanking you were spread. There are some records that say, and I quote, "If a knight found a damsel alone, he would sooner think of cutting his own throat than of causing her dishonor. But on the other hand, if the damsel were accompanied by another knight, and it pleased him to give combat to that knight, and win the lady by the arms, then he might do his will with her, just as he pleased." Also, during that time, Europe's law didn't have much laws to punish crimes. But to compensate for this, for the laws they did have, they wrote them in much detail. For example, if two people were to fight and one breaks their hand, they're fined 20 shillings. One finger, 5 shillings. One eye, 50 shillings. Different teeth had different fines from 1 shilling to 6 shillings. If the entire mouth were to be broken, it is more than 100 shillings. Well, it's overall very complicated. A shilling, by the way, is a unit of money. Long before ancient times, it was originally equivalent to the value of 1 cow. Many people earn less than 10 shillings a year. Aside from bodily harm, many things can be compensated this way. At the same time, people had to do 40 to 80 days of volunteer labor every year, like working for a knight's family. But after thinking about it, it's actually quite a bit similar to modern times. After all, the UK now levies 30 to 40% of taxes. That's pretty much equivalent to giving money earned in 80 to 100 days to others. Understandable. But I think the thing you want to know isn't related to this. It's how do those people in Isekai look like? Are they cute enough, handsome enough, or hentai enough? Well, they looked more or less like us actually. By us, I mean people of European descent. They would have been slightly shorter than average, about 170 centimeters for men, or 5'7", and 161 centimeters for women, or 5'2", compared to modern British people's average of 176 centimeters for men and 162 for women. Their teeth would have had fewer cavities thanks to a diet low in sugar and meat, and high in vegetables, fruit, and milk products, but would have been more worn due to grit in their stone ground bread, and more crooked because of the total lack of orthodontic treatment for all social classes. Most common people would have far less body fat and more lean muscle than most of us if they did physical work, which most would have. They would be on average highly fit, and given that they mostly worked outdoors, fairly tanned. This was why very fair skin and a small, round, slightly fat stomach was considered the height of feminine beauty. Only rich women could have had such a physique. That's because the commoners lacked nutrition, which caused their faces and bodies to be skinny. Therefore, in conclusion, what do we learn about isekais? Well, if you don't want to die from starvation, or just want to lose your weight, you'd better transport yourself to a time period after 1492, but just beware of the Black Death. On the other hand, if you like being clean, or feel your body is a bit on the chubby side, you should definitely transfer yourself to the 16th century. So, now that we know everything about the world, let's all pack our stuff, bring our smartphone, and go to an isekai!